So I'm going to discuss one of my least favourite subjects. That's depth gauges, rakers, drags, whatever you want to call them. I want to go through the very basics, what they are, what they do, how they work, some of the misconceptions about how they work. We're going to cover it all in one video, so hopefully I never have to revisit this whole thing. So to start off with, I'm just going to show you guys up close of a cutter, and we're going to name some parts on it so we all have common terms as we go forward. So that way, hopefully we all understand the same language. Then I want to try and show you what they do, and we'll get more in depth about it from there. Okay, so here we have a cutter. We're looking at it from the outside. Obviously our top plate and our side plate meet in our leading edge, which is a point sticking forward. You may call it the working corner. At the front here we have our depth gauge, raker, drag, whatever you want to call it. If I'm referring to a cutter's heel, it's the rear, and its toe is at the front. There are its rivets that it can pivot on. In front and behind each of these cutters, we have a blank strap. Usually this area at the bottom of the cutter here is referred to as a gullet, but what performs the true gullet function on saw chain is the blank straps behind the cutters. So there's some of the basic parts. The reason we need to adjust depth gauges is because of this top plate clearance angle. So the cutters have a slope, they're higher at the front and lower at the rear. As you file them and they become shorter, they also become lower. So the reason we adjust depth gauges is because we require the leading edge, this little part here of the cutter, where the corner and the side plate meet, to be higher than the depth gauge. So that's required to be higher because as we introduce wood to this process, it goes over the top of the depth gauge and makes contact with the leading edge of the cutter, the point there. If they're too high, the wood just goes straight over the top and makes contact with nothing. You have to put in a lot of feed pressure to try and make it cut. You wear out a chain from the underside up. There's also another issue. If it's too low, if the depth gauge is set too low, then too much of the wood can impact the cutter. It tries to take too big a bite. So there is a required setting. Most manufacturers start with the basic 25 thou or 0.65 mil setting. This may or may not be correct for you, and this is where we're going to go into some detail about how different things affect its ability to cut. So here we are looking at a few cutters when they're engaged with the wood. This one at the front here is just in the early stage of being engaged with the wood. The toe has come away from the bar, the depth gauge is on top of the wood, the leading edge or working corner is engaged with the wood. It is starting to peel a chip towards the inside. But you'll notice at this stage that the heel is in contact with the bar. This is how chain actually pulls chips. In the early stages of it, the leading edge initially makes contact with the wood and it forces the cutter to rock back on its heel because it can move on the rivet here. When it rocks back, the depth gauge impacts the wood and starts its function as a limiter. That is essentially what a depth gauge does. It attempts to limit the amount of rock back a cutter can have. If we allow them to go back too far, they tend to stall in the cut. They'll slam back down into the rail. They wear the heel of the cutter. They wear your bar rails. They create a lot of chatter back through the saw. If they don't go back far enough, they never dig in. And that is what we're adjusting. As we can see here, that top plate clearance angle is allowing it to be, the leading edge to be in the wood, but most of it be off the wood to reduce friction. But we also need that clearance angle when the cutter moves to the following stage after this. So the next stage of the cut that we don't actually have displayed, this will break away from the wood due to chain tension. When it comes down, the cutter's toe comes down first and then the heel. So this cutter would rock forwards, the opposite to what is occurring here. And that is why we really need this top plate clearance angle. We need it to be able to return back to the rail without getting caught up on anything. While we've got an up close on this, we might as well explain it. These ones are currently pulling chips. However, I haven't got the opposite side to do it, so I can't really show it up close. But the side plate drives the chip in towards the center of the chain. The chip gets peeled by the top plate cutting angle here, and the chip starts forming in this channel here called the chip channel, unsurprisingly. Because the chain has constant force and drive on it, it continues moving through the cut at roughly the same speed as always. The chips are very light. Once they break free, they tend to fall behind because they have no drive force. When they fall behind, they pass under the cutter here and then ride in what is the chain's gullet, this blank strap here between the cutters. This is where we get all the other names for depth gauges, rakers and drags and all sorts of things like that. Because the chip's in here, the leading edge or the front edge of the depth gauge actually assists in removing the chips. When it gets to the end and it turns the corner, they just essentially give it a little flick to get rid of it. They can rake or drag chips, and that's how they get those names. So that's the very basics of what they are and what they do. So this is where things start to get complex. The most common belief is a depth gauge is there to set the thickness of the chip, or it controls the thickness of the chip. What they really do is work as a limiter to limit the amount a cutter can rock back. As they rock back further, it creates more vibration and it creates more load on the saw depending on how far it goes back. There is a magnitude of different things that predict how well they do this and also what affects chip thickness. I went to a stupid length to go out and prove this, so you guys will see a fair bit of that. I don't know how I've arrived at the point in my life where I've got a garbage bag taped to my chainsaw while standing in the middle of the bush talking to myself. But kids, stay in school. Don't be me. So this is where we get into the more technical part of these things. What controls chip thickness? What affects it? So it's not just the depth gauge setting. There is many things that go into this. So some of the basics. The top plate cutting angle has an effect. The more top plate cutting angle you have, the more the cutter wants to drive itself into the wood. The lower you hold your file, or the lower you grind, and the more angle you put up there, the harder it is going to want to drive itself into the wood. A perfect example of this is to look at some factory chains. The Husky C series, they're C33, 35, 83 and 85. They come with a 40-degree side plate and top plate cutting angle. They also come with their depth gauges set to about 17 thou. They're trying to strike a balance between that top plate cutting angle and the depth gauges to create a chain feel. The more depth gauge you add, generally the more reaction force you'll get. That's why they can't send it to you with their recommended 25 thou or 0.65 millimeter setting. They have to run them high. The next bit we go into involves feed pressure. We've all heard that a saw should cut just by its own weight. So let's take this as an example. Let's give our whole entire saw, bar chain combination, everything, a nominal weight value of 10. That 10 can be whatever you want it to be. For this, it doesn't matter. They're just 10 weight units. If we take our 10 weight units and we cut a small piece of wood like this, where we've engaged only 2 cutters, each one of those cutters has half of those 10 weight units applied to it. So we have 5 of those weight units. When you cut something like this, there's an extremely high likelihood the depth gauge will penetrate the wood. It has a significant amount of force being applied to just 2 cutters at a time. It is highly likely that it will pull itself up into the wood. Let's take this same saw with its same weight value of 10 and flip this bit of wood round. Say, just to keep the maths simple so we're not confusing ourselves, let's say we have 10 cutters engaged right now. Each of those cutters now only has 1 of those weight units applied to it. There is now significantly less weight being applied to the cutter. That changes the way they react. It removes some of the force when they rock back. It'll change the chip thickness. In a perfect world, we'd be able to set our depth gauges to suit one task. But we know the problem with that. No piece of wood is square. It's rare that you're cutting a perfectly shaped piece of wood. We don't know how many cutters are going to be engaged. The amount changes as we start the cut. When we start off, we may only have 3 or 4. By the halfway point, we may be engaging all of them on one part of the bar, and then we start reducing it. So your chip thickness changes throughout the course of every cut that you make. It is to do with the feed pressure. If you're just using the weight of the saw, it's going to be different as you cut through. There's actually been technical studies done on this. I'll try and link it in the description below if you're interested. They went through and tested this to try and find how feed force affects chip thickness. So one of the main things that affects the overall chip thickness is the ability of the depth gauge to penetrate the wood. As wood density increases, it becomes less likely and it reduces the amount that it can penetrate. To give you a basic example, this is a part of a yellow box, which is an extremely hard species of eucalypt here in Australia. If I just take a regular cutter that I've broken out, this one was a Husky C85 cutter, I just used my fingers, put the depth gauge on the wood, I can score it. Now, I'm not penetrating very far into that, but I'm also applying very little force. This is just me with my hand. We can see the line, we end up with a little line I can feel with my finger. That may have only gone in there 1 thou, but you think about the amount of force that these are hitting with when they're cutting. There is a very good chance it is going to penetrate the wood. The softer the wood, the more they're going to penetrate, the thicker the chip you will get. So another part of chip thickness is the wood diameter. I went out and showed this. I got to the point of ridiculousness of taping a garbage bag to my saw so I could catch some chips and measure them. When I was cutting the smaller piece of wood, it was approximately 3 inches across. I got chip thicknesses ranging from about 0.6 to 0.8 of a millimeter with a depth gauge that was set at 0.63 millimeters, which is 25 thou. Once I moved into a piece of wood that was approximately 12 inches across, they reduced significantly. The average chip thickness come down quite a lot. So all the chips are ranging from between about 0.32 of a millimeter to about 0.50. The chips become noticeably thinner as more of the bar was engaged in the wood. This is because I was only cutting using the weight of the saw. I was allowing it to self-feed. Brings us to the next part of the equation. How do you set depth gauges? There is a multitude of different tools, different styles, different ways, but they all have the same drawbacks. This has a fixed height. This has a fixed height. They're both different, but they're fixed heights. When you move to the progressive style plates, people will say they progressively lower them as they go back, and that is true. However, you have 2 options. You have hardwood and you have softwood. Here's the question. What hardwood did they set this for? Are we talking hardwood as in a European hardwood? Or are we talking really dense hardwoods like this? Limiting yourself to just those options can be a problem. The other thing we have, when they say this is set for a hard or a soft wood, they are set using a factory recommended top plate cutting angle and the rest of the angles on the chain. They may work fantastic with those settings if you're cutting what the manufacturer thinks you are cutting. The problem is the world is not perfect. You are more than likely not cutting what they think you are cutting. You may be outside their application range. You might be using a chain in an environment they weren't expecting. You may be using a bigger saw. You may have a completely different style of using a saw to what they expected you to have. That's where all these gauges fall down. They all have the same fault. You are limiting yourself to an extremely limited range of numbers. Why we're talking the constant and progressive depth gauges. I did a video earlier explaining Carlton's theory that I will link up here somewhere. It goes into depth about the theory that Carlton had, where all these progressive plates come from. There is drawbacks to these ideas. They may work okay in some applications, they work worse in others. They generally work better with chains that have their wear marks or the limit of the amount of chain you can use well behind the rear rivet. On this chain, which is a Stihl 46 RS, it would be useful for the very last bit. But there's no guarantee that the amount that gauge is going to do it is going to work for my application here. It will depend on the type of wood that I'm cutting, the saw I'm using it on and how I am using it is going to cut differently given for any number of different reasons. And that's the problem with all these gauges. So I'll show a bit of video here. I took a Husky 357 and a 325 50 gauge chain out. The first chain you're going to see is a brand new Oregon 20 LGX. It is a full chisel chain with the more what people refer to as professional depth gauge on the front. I took it as it comes out of the box, complete with its 55-degree side plate angle, its 50-degree top plate cutting angle, its 25 thou depth gauges. This is set up to how the manufacturer believes it will work best. The problem is the manufacturer doesn't know the saw I'm using, the bar I'm using, and the wood that I'm cutting, whereas I do. So you're going to see a cut where it self-feeds very poorly, and then some cuts where I assisted it through. Just going to let it self-feed the two cuts. Like that one, that's terrible. The second chain in this lineup is an Oregon 95 TXL. It is a 325 semi-chisel narrow curve chain. It also has the extra hump in front of the drive link. A lot of people will refer to this as a homeowner style chain. The difference is I took this chain, I gave it a light sharpening. I kept the factory angles of 30, 70, and I used that 10 degrees down with my file and got approximately 55 degrees of top plate cutting angle. This is the same specs Oregon actually gives you for this chain. I then made a series of cuts and adjusted the depth gauges to suit. I did not use a tool, I used a flat file. If you're going to do this, you need to be very consistent with the file strokes that you take. I went through and adjusted them. I did it over multiple times. It took me 3 attempts to get them right because I am new to using this saw and that chain combination. As you can see by the cutting speed, there is some significant benefits to doing it. The thing with this is those depth gauge settings are out of sync with any of the gauges I had to compare it to. All right, let's sort of get a rough idea of what we've done here. So that's a normal 25 thou 065 depth gauge. We are below that. That's a Husky roller guide for this style of chain. We are below the hard setting, but we are above the softwood setting. If we use one of these still plates, we are above the hardwood setting. That's the problem with all these tools. Doesn't matter which one you get. Just like the manufacturer's recommendations, they're set up for a sort of general application. You know the wood you're cutting, you know the saw you're using. You know if the wood's very dense or if it's softwood, it's unlikely that the depth gauge is going to dig in. You know your cutting style, you know the feel that you want for a chain. As I said, if you're new to this, use one of them tools. Any of them will do the job. Use whatever you're comfortable with. Once you have a bit of experience, experiment, try different things. You'll find something that works better for you than most of these tools. Throughout the course of this chain's life, you'll probably never see one of them tools, unless I hit something severe and cause major damage and come out of sequence, then there's no reason to. As long as I stay in the sequence and just use it as a chain, I'll just continue lowering it every 3 or 4 times I sharpen it whenever I feel it start dropping off. I couldn't tell you what it'll end up being at the end. I don't even exactly know what it is now. But yeah, didn't want to share this because I'm worried that someone will just file them right down. But that's how I set depth gauges. Now, from experience, I can tell you how I set them is how I want to go. If I go any further than that, I'm going to start running into issues when undercutting or bore cutting. You need to consider all the types of cutting you're going to do with a chain before you set it. I also generally cut wood that is wider than the bar, so I need to be able to have the whole thing engaged. I cannot go very aggressive on those depth gauges because if I do, the saw will stall while it's in the cut with all the cutters engaged. So while we're talking depth gauge tools, most of these flat style tools, doesn't really matter the brand these days, the majority of these are not hardened. These aren't really all that hardened either. This is one of the earlier still ones. This is probably 15 to 20 years old now. These were hardened, however they stopped hardening them around 2010 or 11. They completely changed their description of how these tools are used. So if you have any of these flat style ones or the Oregon ones with the cutout in the middle, they are check or measure gauges. What the manufacturer intends you to do is to place it on top, check. If the depth gauge is above the top of this, you remove the tool, you take your file, you take a stroke and you check. You're removing material until it matches the height of the guide. Their intention is, and if you don't believe me, I'll put Still's own wording of it up there. You do that for the first cutter and then you go and apply that many strokes to every depth gauge as you work your way around the chain. This probably sounds like a pretty crazy idea to most people doing it that way, but it's the way they're actually intending for you to do them. I actually like the idea. It is a good way to develop the skill set to do this without the gauge. Once you have practice of removing an accurate amount off each one, because you have a consistent file stroke with consistent pressure, then it allows you to go and set them all without the tool. If you can set them without the tool, you can set them to the height that's required to complete the job, not the height the manufacturer recommends. Should go a little more in depth on the manufacturer's recommendation. I have spoken to one chain manufacturer. No real secrets on which one. There's only one that will respond to questions. They're well aware that most people aren't going to run these things at that 25 thou setting that they recommend. They have to recommend that. They have lawyers and liability issues and all sorts of things. So they have to recommend something that's safe. But they also understand that for more experienced users, they will probably modify this setting to work for them. So just because the manufacturer recommends it doesn't mean you have to run it. As long as you have the knowledge and required experience to know what is occurring, then you can deviate from those plans. Most people running one of these progressive guides of any description probably are deviating away from the manufacturer's recommendation anyway, so it's not that much of a foreign concept. Okay, it's probably time to wrap this up, but we might as well touch on a few other things. Being able to control the depth gauge settings and knowing how to set your chain up to suit a saw allows you to do different things. I currently run a lot of hard nose bars because they allow more flexibility. I can run multiple chain pitches on any given bar. With that and a combination of different rim sprockets, you can essentially make anything work how you want if you know how to set the chain up for the task. If you're someone who prefers the feel of higher chain speeds, say running a 388 or a 3258 on a saw that really shouldn't run it, you can generally make it work by just setting the chain up to suit. If you like that feel, you can achieve it. There's all sorts of different things you can do once you step outside that realm. As you can see, I've got a collection of different tools and gauges and crap that I've used over the years. While they all do work to a degree, you can generally find something that suits your application better. It allows you to mix and match different rim sprockets, different bars. You might prefer running short bars or long bars. You might like the feel of high chain speed. There's a whole heap of different things that goes into this, and being able to adjust that chain setup to suit is a big part of being able to do it. Learning to do this gives you a lot of options. But just keep in mind, when you first start off, there is an extremely high likelihood that you are going to ruin a chain. You are going to go too far. You need to know what the signs of that are. You need to take your time as you're adjusting them. Don't make big adjustments at once. Just ease your way into it. It takes time to get the feel for it. Once you have a feel for it, if it's a bar and chain combination you're used to on that saw, you can generally set these things up really quickly. So that's some of depth gauges. My intention in the beginning was to make one video and be done with it, but given we're probably already 25 or 30 minutes into this and we haven't touched on a lot of things, then it's clear that's not going to happen. Maybe this is something I revisit every 6 months or something and add a little bit more to it. I guess the important things to get across, when you're new, you need to lower them. Use a tool. You're going to cut better than people that don't understand that they need to be lowered. Use a tool, use any tool, whatever you are comfortable with, use something. Once you progress beyond that stage, you can start playing with things. Once you learn the relationship between all the different angles and the depth gauge setting, the saw weight, the wood diameter, the wood density, and all of those things, you can start tweaking things to suit your application. So yeah, we'll wrap this up. We'll call it a day on it. I'll revisit it later. It turns out there's too much to include in one video. This whole saw chain stuff is really stupidly simple and so incredibly complex at the same time. It all comes down to 3 angles and a depth gauge. It shouldn't be this hard, but when you start getting right into it, it becomes more detailed, it becomes a bit more technical, and you can start doing things outside the realms of what they ever intended you to do. Anyway, we'll just wrap it up. We'll call that a day and we'll revisit it later on.